France has fallen again.
What time is this now?
It hasn't, for like the umpteenth time. No, it hasn't fallen, but their government has collapsed. So I thought we could talk about that because it's, not the biggest of deals ever, but it's worth mentioning at least.
Just double checking, this was the coalition government that formed explicitly to keep Le Pen out, right? Because it was a coalition of liberals and communists to make sure that they didn't get as much representation as they needed.
So I was going to save that point till towards the end, but it is the crux. No, it's fine. It is the crux of it. So let's just say that now. The only reason why the government was so doddery in the first place, why it was so easy for it to collapse at all, is because it is a government built on foundations of sand, basically, isn't it? I mean, there's no majority of any given faction or party in their lower house, their assembly.
So France has both a prime minister and a president, doesn't it? And so Barnier was the prime minister.
Yeah. So let's make that clear.
Macron is the president.
So let's make that clear right away, because in Britain and in America, we've got a different system. Obviously, their president is the head of government and the head of state. Here, our prime minister is the head of government, and it's the king that's head of state. In France, their president, Macron, is the head of state, not the head of government. So, in other words, the whole point of saying all of that is that their prime minister, Michel Barnier, and his government collapsed. But that doesn't affect Macron, well, not directly. Macron's not going to be... isn't ousted as president, head of state, or anything like that. It does make his political position more tenuous than it already was, but this doesn't mean that Macron is going to go necessarily in the immediate future. But we'll talk about what repercussions it will have for his career. Anyway, so Bernier, if anyone remembers, our American audience might not, probably wouldn't, but Brits might, that he was one of the lead EU negotiators when we had Brexit. So he is sort of an arch pro-European type. No wonder Macron chose him to be his prime minister. So the story is that what happened is he was doing a budget, and it was just extremely unpopular by everyone else. There's three main factions in France, in the French Assembly. There's sort of the pro-Macronist centrists, sort of left of centre centrist types. There's sort of the more left wing. What's that called? That is the New Popular Front.
Mm-hmm. And
then there's Le Pen's sort of right-leaning, sort of semi-right-leaning. Well, but of course the mainstream media always call them far-right.
Well, it's confusing as well because
National Rally.
Of the parties in France are economically left-wing. There's no economically right-wing party in France. That it just varies on the social dimension. Can't even speak.
Le Pen and National Rally are not particularly all that right-wing.
Yeah, they're
not. They're certainly not far right. They're certainly not far right. That isn't, by the old school use of the definition, far right. They're not. But of course, the mainstream media always say that, don't they? Always. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, the left and the right, the New Popular Front and National Rally, both sort of were against Macron's sort of left centrism, and that's what Barnier sort of represents. Just trying to carry on. Whilst France falls off a cliff in all sorts of ways, Macron and someone like Barnier just want to just keep going with that. And they've had enough of it. So he released a budget where he was trying to actually, from what I gather anyway, trying to do something mildly prudent. He was trying to reduce the French deficit, national deficit, to the tune of 50-odd billion pounds. God knows what that would be in euros. But so he's actually trying to do something mildly conservative with a small c, fiscally speaking, but neither side was particularly happy with that, and so when it became clear that he wasn't going to be able to sort of get it through, even their lower house, the Assembly, he just sort of used emergency powers, quote unquote emergency powers measures to force it through. So it hadn't been voted on and agreed by the Assembly, and so that was the final straw for a lot of the people in the Assembly. And so they had a vote of no confidence against him and his government. They needed 288 votes and got 331. So in the scheme of things, not even that close. They got it quite easily.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is obliged to resign, which he's done. He'll still be caretaker prime minister for a fair few weeks now, commentators are saying, while Macron picks someone new. But, this hasn't happened in France. It's a fairly rare thing, this, to happen in Western countries. In France, certainly. Hasn't happened since the 60s. It's 60 odd years since something like this last happened.
It's quite some time in politics, isn't it?
Yeah. It is quite embarrassing. Obviously, it's quite embarrassing, isn't it, when you have to resign?
I mean, he's French to start off with, which is bad enough.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think also I am going to revel in his humiliation because of his role as the negotiator for the EU in Brexit. And from what I can remember, at least, he was a bit of a stick in the mud.
Yeah, he was a complete dick. Yeah, he's
One
no
way of
friend
putting
of
it,
ours.
yeah.
He's no friend of ours. Absolutely. No, he would have done anything or everything to undermine our ability to leave the EU, and did.
Mm-hmm.
So his term as Prime Minister was only 3 months long. So again, an embarrassment for him and Macron. Yeah, bit of a fail. Okay, so Le Pen said that it was, quote, the only dignified solution to have a vote of no confidence in him. She said that the budget was toxic for the French, and there's simply, quote, no other solution to this. So another point to make about France is that the last election they had, the one we mentioned, where it was a stitch-up, really. Bit of a stitch. I mean, a legal one, but still stitch-up.
Yeah, they stayed in the bounds, but what they did was sort of... it seemed sort of, in a moral sense, cheating. But even though it was acceptable within the rules of French democracy, they basically colluded with one another to kick out Le Pen's national rally from any constituency they had a chance of winning by selectively removing candidates.
Well, this is the point of a lot of European democratic politics in the first place, right? It's the whole idea of the cordon sanitaire. Just keep the far right out. Keep Hitler 2.0, which is obviously Le Pen. Marine Le Pen was gonna, send them back and do all of these evil Nazi things. That's the whole point of it. Even if it would just be like a baby step, maybe in the direction that you think could lead to Auschwitz II, stop it.
But
we need to ally with communists over and over and over again.
Well, they
always
push
works
this
great.
far right thing all the time, and they call people far more extreme than they actually are to make. This is my personal theory, to make the people who would otherwise support them think that they're going to be more radical than they actually are. And I think actually a lot of these politicians in Europe, these so-called far-right politicians, are actually not far-right at all, and in many ways are sometimes actively left-wing. Like, people were saying Giorgia Meloni is fascist and extremely far-right, and she's still increasing immigration, still not done anything about it.
Well, there's two purposes for that sort of thing. I think one, it's to push some people away, and I think it's also to try and trick people into a form of containment, because people are so sick of how European politics have been going for so long that if you tell someone that, you can vote for a radical, they go, thank God, I want radical solutions to the problems that we've got, and they vote for them, and they get
the same
neoliberalism as usual.
So in the last election, it was Macron called it as a snap election. Hoping to sort of undermine or undercut Le Pen and National Rally, and even though it was legal, there was all sorts of leftist coalition shenanigans going on to sort of keep them out. Anyway, the net result of all of that was, as I say, there's no majority of any single party or faction in the Assembly, which means that there will be some sort of a stalemate in their legislature until the next, and at the first possible opportunity legally under the French Constitution isn't until summer next year. Sort of July is the first possible time they could have. So, in other words, the whole time between now and then will probably be a bit of a shit show for the French government. Macron will pick someone else, and he'll be as weak as can be. He'll be like a Barnier type figure, try and do things, won't be able to. If he tries to force anything through, will probably face another vote of no confidence to the tune of 330 odd people ousting him. So it's just going to be sort of a holding pattern and stagnation for French government until summer next year, if another election is called at that earliest possible opportunity, which doesn't necessarily have to be. Macron could just hold on for longer if he wanted to, if he's happy to watch his country just burn and disintegrate and implode, which it seems he is, because that's what he's been doing ever since he ever got into power.
Well, it's also worth pointing out that when he called that snap election, he was actually quite unpopular in the polls, and everyone was saying at the time, what is he doing? Why is he doing this? So obviously he knew in advance that he'd arranged this agreement with the far left to keep the Le Pen out, who actually got the most in the popular vote as well, despite coming third in the election in terms of seats.
I think it was something that was arranged because they had a few rounds of voting, and after the first round I think it became very, very clear that Le Pen was going to get through, and so they tactically took certain seats where the leftist vote would have been split between the centrists and the communists, and then tactically removed some candidates to try and force them out so the leftist vote could be more concentrated.
Mm-hmm.
That is exactly how it went down.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, nothing actually illegal or unconstitutional, but
scummy.
And highlights the fact that there are just those types of loopholes to be taken advantage of. It's
That's
classic.
The point
it's
of democracy, really, isn't it?
Right,
Sometimes.
Just like in Germany, anything will be done to keep the AfD out. Any sort of weird coalition to prevent AfD from gaining power at all costs. Just like they tried to do with Geert Wilders in Holland.
Well, yeah, it's funny that because in Germany, obviously, they're trying to ban the AfD, and with Wilders, they only agreed to the coalition if he wasn't their prime minister. And so they've actually got someone who wasn't a politician as prime minister to make the coalition work. A fellow by Dick Schoof, that's his name.
Pardon?
That's his name.
And
One more time?
Dick Schoof.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
And the same would happen here if if there was no clear leader and Reform, as wet as they are, if they were able to be in a position to try and form some sort of coalition government with one of the other parties, they would just refuse to and form any sort of coalition, no matter how nonsensical it was politically, ideologically, to just keep the far right out of power. Even though they're not the far right.
I reckon they might go into coalition with the Tories, maybe.
Well,
there's so many ex-Tories looking to defect to them already, aren't there?
Basically just like an extracurricular club for Conservatives, isn't it, at this point, the Reform Party?
It's like the naughty step for them.
It is, yeah.
You've been naughty, sit on the naughty step.
Okay, sit with Nigel.
All right.
So Barnier himself he basically said, look, I haven't done this out of spite or anything. France actually needs this budget. Like, come on. He's quoted as saying, we have reached a moment of truth, of responsibility. We need to look at the realities of our debt. I did not present almost exclusively difficult measures because I wanted to.
It's a fair point, actually, isn't it? Can't really fault him for saying that.
Yeah, it's not doing it out of spite. It was, I give him some credit that he's trying to do what he thought was the right thing, I suppose.
I mean, I have some recommendations personally, but there's going to be a lot of unemployed bureaucrats.
So Macron apparently is going to address the issue this evening, I believe. He was on some sort of state visit to Saudi Arabia, and he was on his way back because his government has fallen. And so probably the last thing to talk about or mention is, what does this mean for Macron himself? Well, it is sort of politically damaging, of course. Not only does it mean that whatever government he puts together next will almost certainly be extremely weak, it is sort of a death knell, isn't it? It does sort of the bell is tolling for the end of his political career, right?
And
I agree.
Macron has proven to be a bit of a cockroach, though, hasn't he?
Yeah.
He's weathered a lot. He seems to always manage to scrape through somehow. So
yeah. People saying, obviously the questions come thick and fast, don't they? Mr. Macron, what does this mean for, are you going to resign? Trying to put, people like Le Pen, and even the far left in France, trying to put pressure on him to just resign. This is so embarrassing, surely you should resign, do the right thing, blah, 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 blah. But he's just saying, no, of course, no way, of course not. He's the type of politician, like most politicians really, will never give up on the game until it gives up on him. Right? Would never resign unless he absolutely had to. He said it was sort of, what did he call it, make-believe politics, that he's going to resign, or that there will be a new French president in the next few days or weeks.
Well, I like to think of it as being forced to resign is humiliating, and if you're egocentric enough to assume the highest office in your country, then you're probably going to avoid that as much as possible, even if it makes you hated. It's better than admitting defeat, and I think that's the psychology that often plays on the individual's mind. But of course, it's never just up to them and whether they want to do it or not. There are lots of forces that determine whether you stay in the position.
I mean, having to resign purely out of political humiliation is quite rare. I mean, in America, for example, that's only ever happened to Richard Nixon. He was almost certainly going to get impeached, and then probably have to face a trial. So instead of that, he resigned. He's the only one. You take someone like Tony Blair. He sort of resigned, but it wasn't the same thing. It wasn't out of political humiliation as such. It was because he'd had all sorts of deal. Yeah. There was some sort of, he should have moved aside even earlier, really, for Gordon Brown. And so just to be so humiliated in a political sense that you have to resign is rare, and I think most politicians would rather just crawl on as a lame duck, just crawl on with a really, really weak government and just play out your time rather than that. That's sort of the worst it could be, to have to do that.
I imagine there must be a bit of a sunk cost fallacy of, well, I've come this far, so, how much more worse can it get?
France is already burning down and imploding and ruined in all sorts of senses, so what's another 6 months matter? Sort of thing.
And really, France ended in 1789, would you say? It's been all downhill since there. Also, on Nixon, wasn't it just Watergate that forced him to resign? Yeah, see, because he made a big mistake there. He forced to resign in all the scandal of spying on people's phone calls. He should have just passed the Patriot Act. Actually, it's legal for me to do that now. It's fine for me to do that. You can't do that anymore.
Yeah, you don't get people resigning for spying on people anymore. It's just like, yes, I'm spying on you. Do you have anything to hide? Why are you concerned about it? They sort of gaslight you. It's like, yes, I'm watching you. Always.
Well, it wasn't just the
That's
Watergate.
Josh, personally, actually.
It wasn't just the Watergate break-in. If anyone's interested, there's a multiple-part series on the YouTube channel History Bro.
Who's that?
Which is it's just an excellent history channel.
Yeah, there's.
This is an independent review.
This is not affiliated with anyone on this panel.
No. But there is a multiple-part series on there all about Watergate, and it's not actually really the break-in, because it seems like Nixon didn't directly audit. It was that he lied about it. It was that he said he had nothing to do with it, didn't know anything about it.
So he
didn't set the FBI to try and call off the CIA or all those things. And those things were shown to be lies, that he had lied to the public on camera multiple times.
So really, he really should have just admitted it and then made it law that he was able to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. America's a fun place.
Okay, in Le Monde, leading French newspaper, someone who's very close to the National Rally leadership, an advisor to them, said he's talking about Barnier, but also basically talking about Macron's time in power, that he's, quote, a fallen Republican monarch, advancing with his shirt open and a rope around his neck up to the next dissolution of Parliament, i.e. up to the next election. Macron is now just... He's just waiting. It's just a stay of execution, this, really, politically speaking. And so he's done, right? He will almost certainly lose his position at the next election, whether it's in July next year or whenever it is.
Because he's already incredibly popular, and this is just another straw on the already broken camel's back, really.
Of course, being sarcastic there, he's very, very unpopular, isn't he?
Mm.
I mean, he's been there for quite some while now, hasn't he? Quite a few years now. Yeah, he's going to need to move aside, let someone else do it.
Was it 2015 he got in?
I can't remember the exact date, but that sounds about right.
That feels right.
Is it? Yeah.
So look maybe at how well France has been going since.
So maybe next summer will be Marine Le Pen's time. Maybe. We'll see. We'll see how it goes.
She can let us down.
2017, apparently.
Oh, okay. All right. A few years off.
Not a bad innings for a French president. It's obviously no de Gaulle. But,
still got his head on his shoulders, that's a start.
Yeah. It is embarrassing that over the past few days there's been all of these headlines about South Korean coup, Macron, French government collapse, and it's all just so disappointing when you start to look at the reality of this, isn't it? Just all a bit boring.
Everything seems to collapse and reassembles itself as neoliberalism again, doesn't it?
South Korea has the most low testosterone failed coup I've ever seen in my life.
Sort of milled about, didn't they?
Yeah, they got pushed back by middle-aged bureaucrats, and France is just like, oh, okay, no economic reforms here. Switch a few people around, sorted.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you can always watch us have fun in Lads Hour, where we sort of are a bit laid back, have a bit of fun, and if you want to see all the other things that we're up to, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.